Hey everyone, it's Jonathan, and welcome back to I Heart Movies. One of these days I'll have a schedule for this show, but today is not that day. Today I am just randomly releasing a Disney episode that I had planned to release last year. We actually recorded this over a year ago in January, right after we recorded the episodes in our Latin American Disney series, which already aired last September. I originally meant to release this not long after those episodes, which I think we even reference in this episode, but it kept getting delayed for other projects. And suddenly we were at the holidays, and I just ran out of time. I'd even thought about releasing it at the end of the season last year, just to get it out there. But I never got time to get it edited, and I do prefer to end the season with Christmas episodes anyway. So instead of ending it on a heavy note with a World War II film, we ended it on a completely different kind of heavy note with that utterly bleak and depressing Christmas Carol miniseries. So I don't know which kind of heaviness I should have preferred to end the season with. Actually, I do. I probably would have preferred this one. Anyway, not getting back into that, let's move on to the topic at hand. Today's episode is another in our Disney movie marathon series. However, this is a completely different kind of episode because we're talking about one of Disney's very least known animated films, one that he made during the 40s in his war era, but one that's even less well known than Make Mine Music. This is 1943's Victory Through Air Power, a film made for the express purpose of influencing the war effort during World War II. Joining me for this episode is my cousin Sarah, who is something of a history buff, especially for that time period, so she was actually interested in talking about this film, despite its subject matter, because war movies really aren't her thing. But the historical significance of this one won her interest, so she ended up being totally up for it. Okay, Victory Through Air Power, one of the most different movies we've ever watched for this show.
It's a bummer.
Yeah, kinda. And from what I didn't know was that this is actually based on a book. I had no idea that this was based on a book, but apparently Walt Disney read this book by Alexander de Seversky. Probably butchering the pronunciation, but it's in the movie, so if you watch it, you'll know who I'm talking about.
Yes, a very knowledgeable Russian man.
Yes, he's actually in the movie as well. So he wrote this book. Apparently he was like mentored by this guy, General Billy Mitchell, and the movie is dedicated to this guy who he apparently foresaw the coming conflict, and he talked about the way planes were going to be used, and nobody listened to him. So basically the book was written to try and make people take his ideas seriously, and then the film subsequently as well.
And just to be really specific, he foresaw World War II. I know not everybody is going to necessarily... But I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, then you probably know when World War II happened, but...
Yeah.
1939 through 1945.
Mm-hmm. But apparently the planes weren't used quite as much before this movie. Like in World War I, they were used, but not to the degree that apparently Alexander de Seversky thought they should be.
I mean, honestly, okay, it starts with the history of aviation, and, I mean, which sounded like it wasn't maybe totally, completely accurate, but I think it was a helpful
Yeah, it may not have been, like, completely comprehensive, but it was enough that you kind of got the gist of...
And really, one of the things you can take away from this is just how much war pushes the development of the technologies surrounding aviation. And honestly, from the early 1900s through 1945, it's kind of ridiculous how much technology exploded.
Yeah, that's the thing that surprised me the most about this, was just seeing how fast technology progressed from the first flight all the way through to the time period that this was made.
It's the age that we're in. I mean, kind of, you have the Industrial Revolution, but really, I don't know, the 1900s, just such an explosion of knowledge and development. Human nature hasn't changed, but, you know, the things that we're tinkering with have.
So anyway, around this time, Walt Disney read this book. This is about the same time we were talking in the last podcast about he had a couple of flops. At the time of this movie, It had grown to 3. Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi had all flopped and had all cost a ton of money. So basically, he couldn't afford to do much. So he really, in a way, cut corners big time for this movie.
But
and
he couldn't afford to do it, period. It was totally Walt style to be like, I have this vision, we're doing this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we're just running on gas.
And that's basically what they were doing. And unless you're like really looking for it, you can't tell that this is a much cheaper film.
I mean, you can read technical explanations of how they simplified it, but for a layperson like me, I don't get that impression.
And I wasn't really paying attention the first time we watched it, but I watched it a second time when I was like doing my notes and getting ready for the podcast, and I could tell that there was like really limited animation, but the way they did it, it was basically so that the layperson couldn't tell. Like they used very limited background, and because most of the animation is airplanes and bombs and things, like when the airplanes are flying, it's just the airplane moving. There's no limb movement like you would for people. When the bombs are falling, it's just the bomb is falling.
But there was some detailed animation, and it was said that in one of the articles that you sent to me that they would have been more prepared for that because of the detailed animation that they were doing in, say, Bambi and Fantasia.
Mm-hmm. The detailed animation, there was people at the beginning with like the history of aviation, and then there's a whole thing at the end with like an eagle. So there are character animations here and there, but for the most part, it's maps and airplanes and diagrams, things that don't really need a whole lot of animation. And they were able to, I guess, hide the fact that they didn't need to animate a lot just by the very fact that it's airplanes. They don't have a lot of movement to them if they're just going overhead. You can basically just copy the same frame over and over and over again.
One of the things that I found interesting was the struggle that they had with the live action because they had so much airplane noise outside of the studio. I mean, it kind of reminds us of us trying to record in a totally less dramatic way of just how much, they're recording at night. Mm-hmm. They're having to try and work around Seversky's handicap because he's missing a leg, and there's his whole war history. But historically, this is an extremely interesting film and the story around it because it very likely changed the history of the war. It did change the history of the war, and it probably changed the long-range history of aviation. That might be too big, but I doubt it. Because this film actually influenced Winston Churchill and FDR, and it made FDR want to commit to long-range missiles. It is probably overreaching in the fact that he is presenting all of these ideas like they're fact and everything, but I really feel like this came from a point of deep concern with Walt and a genuine desire to help the people and help the country. It's like he read this in my mind, in my heart. I think that he really wanted to put this out there so that he could help the American people win. And they made it in such a way that they're saying, okay, if we keep trying to use these tactics, we're basically going to exhaust ourselves and we're going to lose. But he keeps infusing it with this hope, like, but if we do this thing, we can win, and it's going to save lives, it's going to save American lives, and it's going to be great, and, insert eagle flying majestically. So it's really something. I mean, and I never knew that Disney had this influence through this film. If it had just been this Russian-American military person writing a book, I don't know how much notice FDR would have taken of that.
I don't think that there was a whole lot of notice before this film, because the film is what got this guy, it gave him a platform.
I could see him just being a voice with many others putting out military ideas. But to have Walt come in with all of these visuals and make pro and con arguments that are so strong, and and like I say, it's still infusing it with hope. It's just really interesting. And then that the British would take an idea that was put forth in that cartoon and actually make it, and it was called the Disney bomb.
Yeah.
I never knew.
No,
it's not the focus of documentaries. Not that, I mean, there are so many aspects to World War II. So this is a very interesting little rabbit hole. The film it kept making me want to cry, honestly, especially towards the beginning, because you start out with this amazing, very innocent invention, and it just shows this very slow progression of, in World War II, they weren't fighting with each other when they were flying, and then next thing you know, they're shooting at each other with pistols and then machine guns, and it's just, people are so good at killing each other and taking that creative power and killing each other. And I'm not wearing a daisy crown right now and saying, every war is wrong and everybody's bad that engages in war. Someday there will be no war, but for now there is, and I think it's okay to be sad about it. So if you watch this and you're a sensitive little person, you may feel sad. And I think for people watching this, it would be so easier for them to feel like, yeah, American, we're gonna go take down the bad guy. And there was so much creepy ideology and so many bad things happening that, yes, things needed to be stopped. So I'm not saying, America shouldn't have stepped in and helped rescue. It just makes me sad. Another thing, looping back to some of the simplicity of the animation, they were really, really starting to run out of money, probably feeling really time pressured. One of the things that you notice about this film is how they talk about hitting the source where the supplies are being made, which is very, very intelligent. But they actually, and it's interesting towards the end of the film, like earlier in the film, they're focusing more on Germany, but towards the end of the film, it's really focusing more on defeating Japan, which is kind of interesting considering that there was victory in Europe first and then victory over Japan. But one of the things that's striking is when they're taking down these production centers or supply centers, the whole, you don't see any dead people. And I can't help but wonder, I really doubt that was for the simplicity of animation. I think, there are two thoughts that I had. If you had any younger audiences, like if somebody brought in little Timmy, that's going to be more palatable. But also, I think it would be far easier for people to stomach and still feel patriotic and hopeful if you don't see a bunch of people getting blown up. So I really think that was on purpose. It helps to make it seem, more clean, we're just going to take out their supplies and it's going to be so much better.
But there are people working in those factories.
Exactly. And it made me see, another interesting thing about this film is while you're watching it, I really like that it's during the war. And so they don't have the conclusion of the story. And you have this perspective that is really in the war, of the war, trying to win the war. And there's no allusion to nuclear warfare because, as far as the world is concerned, this is not a thing. At the time, they were probably working on it, but it's not a thing. And they have that whole diagram showing how big the bombs either would get or could get or were. And it made me want to look up just how big the nuclear bombs got. Because the biggest one they showed was 10,000 pounds. And quiz, what were the bombs named that were dropped on Japan?
I know I've heard this, but I can't remember right now.
The first one was Little Boy. The second one was Fat Man.
Okay.
Not Batman, Fat Man. And honestly, I don't know why they necessarily had that much of a difference in the titles, because they were both huge. Little Boy was smaller, but it's just interesting to think about, while watching this and afterwards. I mean, cover your children's ears. I just think about hearing about somebody wandering along after the nuclear attack carrying their eyes, because the explosion had literally knocked their eyes out. And it's so dark and it's so raw. And when you think of the people being subdued, you don't think of something like that happening. And Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima, and that was on purpose. They had purposefully, so Disney has this whole, kind of cleaned up version of warfare.
Well, he probably had no idea what they were doing with the nuclear project.
Well, I'm just saying, well, he had a concept of what war would look like, I'm sure, beyond that. But
you can tell from, the bomb sizes that they were talking about being just potential, that they had no idea how big they were actually going to be when they were...
Well, okay. Little Boy was around 9,700 pounds. And they purposefully chose Hiroshima, and they purposefully didn't bomb it. They were keeping it for a bigger impact for when they dropped the bomb on it. And it was flatland, so the immediate casualties were actually bigger than the second bomb. And that was, for anybody interested in dates, that was August 6th, 1945. 66,000 were killed, 69,000 were injured, and out of that total number, 20,000 of those were soldiers. So the civilian casualties far exceeded. And then for Fat Man, it wasn't actually supposed to be dropped on Nagasaki. They had a different target, which I don't know how to pronounce. It looks like Kokura. But there wasn't good visibility due to, I believe, fire raids. And they ended up switching to Nagasaki, which was their second choice. And that was August 9th. So it happened pretty quickly. And the casualties were a little bit hazier on that. But that bomb weighed around 10,361 pounds. So yeah, it was bigger by hundreds of pounds, but still not like thousands.
I still think that in this film, the way they were talking about how they would be used was completely different than nuclear warfare. I don't think they would have even... maybe they would have had a concept of what nuclear warfare was, but the way they were talking about it was using the bombs basically to create earthquakes and take out dams, not wipe out major civilian population centers. Which
someone said that Seversky was either prophetic or well-informed as far as taking out dams. So that's obviously
that was something they did later, too.
But I just want to say 60 to 80,000 people were killed, either immediately or long term. And I want to be dark about this. I'm not saying that Disney is a bad person. I just would like to point out what actually did happen.
Yeah.
And I think, the long-range missiles, I think it's a good idea. And if you can target supplies far more than people, yes. I'm definitely for that. So that whole concept of trying to save American lives and hit it at the source, it's very good logic. And it's definitely one still in the brains of people today, thankfully. But I think, while this is sad, it is relatively safe for kids.
Mostly, yeah.
I think if you wanted to use this as an educational film with some addendums, yeah. You probably Could. The thing that felt the most like propaganda to me was at the end of the film,
Yes,
with the whole
definitely.
battle between the octopus and the eagle and everything. For the most part, well, and people would not like them calling them Japs, would they?
No.
Yeah. So that happened in this as well. But at the time, I'm sure nobody was offended by that.
Well, nobody, like, on
The American
our
side.
I really think they probably didn't care what the other side thought.
Sure. Oh, and this is also not necessarily part of the film, but I thought it was very interesting. In the second nuclear bomb, one of the areas that they actually did hit and severely impair, it was one of the places that had supplied either machines or weaponry that were utilized during the Pearl Harbor attack. Which I thought was very interesting because that does feel like justice. I mean, I'm glad the war is over and that we can visit these countries, but I thought it was interesting that that blow was dealt at the time.
The end basically is, like you said, it's probably the most propaganda-ish. They have the eagle fighting the octopus, which obviously the eagle is America, and the octopus, it's over Japan, but it's like, I'm not sure they were saying that the octopus was Japan because the tentacles of the octopus were reaching into all these other places.
I think it was Japan because they were talking about, Japan having control over these islands, and if you try and get at them through these islands, the difficulties that would ensue.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the idea was strike the head and the tentacles will let go of these other areas that they have taken control over.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wasn't sure if the octopus necessarily was supposed to be exactly Japan.
I think so. I think so.
But yeah.
And didn't you see the nefarious look in its eye?
Well, I wasn't sure if they were using it as Japan and the Axis forces.
I don't think so.
Centered in Japan.
I don't know.
I'm probably thinking about it too much. You probably will just say it was Japan, and that's
because they really dealt with Germany separately. It felt like.
Yeah, that's true. So yeah, I guess we'll just say the octopus is Japan. But that's where it ends. The octopus dies. Its tentacles get out of all the different places that they were holding on to, like all the little islands, and there was like weapons and things. So yeah, that's the end. The eagle flies away, lands on a flagpole. It's all patriotic. And that's the end of the movie. Oh, I guess there was also that whole thing right before this. Like, it started out, like, the final scene started out, when you said that part of it made you want to cry, I thought you were going to talk about the end, because it was like, that's where it seemed like the most violent, I guess.
No.
Because there was all the bombs and...
No, really, I think this... Well, I don't know if that made me want to cry at all, actually. Because the thing that was saddest to me was just the development of warfare.
That makes sense.
And the loss of brotherhood and kindness and innocence. And not that humanity has ever been... I mean, we've been fighting a long time. So...
Yeah. But yeah, there's the whole thing where basically they're talking about the U.S. forces laying waste to all those factories and things, and then it turns into the eagle fighting the octopus.
Which, another thing, they were basing this out of Alaska, and I hadn't noticed when they are flying out how I did notice the totem. And, I figured, okay, they're indicating that this is Alaska through the totem. But it was pointed out that there's an eagle on top of it that looks kind of like the American eagle.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that. That's interesting.
So just a little nugget. I don't know if it means anything, if it was on purpose, but if you watch it, then, maybe keep an eye out for that. But it's towards the end.
Yeah. Yeah, and then that is basically the end. So... if you're interested, the film barely made back its production budget, which you kind of figure. So basically, this movie was another financial loss for the studio. Not just because it barely made back its production budget, but like with this film, there's no marketing opportunities. So like you can't make stuffed animals out of the characters. There's no way to market this beyond just being a film. So
And
and
it didn't need to be replayed that much. I mean, there's only so
no.
long the war went. So
But
it's, yeah.
I really think that Disney really didn't care about that. He made this for a purpose and he got what he wanted out of it.
Yes, it was totally successful for what he wanted it
Yeah.
for. If you influence two of the most powerful leaders in the world to come over to your side through your film, you accomplish something.
Yeah. And that it sounds like that happened.
And I bet it boosted morale in the country. I'm sure there were a lot of people wandering around. There are probably a lot of people wandering around wondering, how on earth are we going to win this thing? And have somebody come out with a brief film that's like, this is how we can do it. It probably sparked a lot of conversation.
Probably. Because something like this, the ideas, I feel like, are a lot easier to get across through animation than they are to read a long, heavy book.
Like, how many people in that day and age, even if they care a lot about the war, are going to sit down and read a military book?
Yeah, no, probably not a whole lot.
They'll read their newspaper and go to the movies and, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I found most interesting reading about the film later was that this was actually, even beyond being influential in the war effort, this was influential for the Disney company as a whole, because this was the beginning of them creating educational films. Because if you look back at the history of Disney, before this they hadn't really done a whole lot, but after this they started making like military educational films. They did stuff for schools, apparently even for factories, and it all started with this film. And I just found that really interesting that it kind of changed the course of where the company went for a little while.
Wasn't there one called something like Preparing for Death?
I don't know.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it was for soldiers during wartime, but if I thought this one made me sad, I probably shouldn't watch that one.
Well, yeah, I just found that interesting.
A lot of interesting stuff around this. And they did reuse, like, originally the History of Flight was meant for another project, and they did reuse that in, a film collection, or...
I think I read that they used it in some of their anthology TV series, because Disney would reuse, like, shorts and things in Wonderful World of Disney.
So I can't help but wonder
how
many people out there might actually be familiar with that part of the film, but not with the rest of us.
Yeah, because the beginning of the film, it's basically a normal-ish Disney short.
Right. It doesn't take long to get into the war stuff, but...
Yeah.
Yeah, and you commented while we were watching this that it felt longer than the amount of time that we had been watching it. I don't know if we were a half hour in.
Yeah, we were only about halfway through, and I was thinking we were probably about at the end. But no, it just felt long.
Probably because some of the content's just a little bit heavier.
Mm-hmm.
So
and it's not quite as entertaining as Cinderella or some other happy Disney movie.
Yeah, it's just not... I would recommend this. I would definitely recommend this as very historically interesting.
Yeah.
At the beginning, mildly entertaining, but... it's serious subject matter, so...
Yeah. I would recommend it as something educational about history.
And definitely, if you're a World War II buff and you're not familiar with Disney's trip to South America and this film, these have both been very interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are my recommendations. Just, I guess, know that there's a little bit of racially sensitive content and...
Yeah, we recommend it with caveats.
Which you
probably should know. You would know going into something from that time period. There's probably going to be stuff that wouldn't fly today, but
yeah, I guess depending on who's watching it, how to approach the subject matter. Like if you're showing it to say you wanted to show it to a 10-year-old, maybe explain to them that we don't call them Japs.
Yeah.
Yeah, have the talk, or just think before you watch, I guess, which is probably some of the best advice for anything. So,
yeah.
I think those were most of my thoughts.
Yeah.
Keep your tissues handy and your Wikipedia cross-references and dive in there.
Yeah. So, I think next time when we get into some more Disney films,
we're going to watch something happy.
Yes. we're going to be, technically we already are in this era, but we're going to be in the war era, which sounds heavy, but the films that we're going to be watching aren't heavy. Basically, during the war, like we've been talking about, Disney had a bunch of flops, lost a lot of money. To save money, they made films that were basically just a bunch of shorts strung together. So there's 4 films coming up. Some people count Saludos Amigos and Three Caballeros as part of these package films, I guess they're called. I guess they are, but I kind of count them as their own little tiny subsection because of the historical value of them, the significance of them. But the next 4, they're a bunch of shorts that are all put together that have like a different theme, like they're stories or music. There's 2 that are specifically sort of Fantasia-ish, but not classical music. Just music is a common theme in them.
Kind of like silly symphonies where it's the story put to a song.
Yeah, a bunch of silly symphonies packaged into a full feature. So there's going to be 4 of those.
It sounds like something I can handle.
Yes, a lot less heavy than what we've been watching.
Which, no regrets.
Yeah, no.
We need both in life.
Yeah, but we're going to get into a lighter area.
Yeah.
Even though it was made during a heavy time, it's lighter content.
Yes. Okay. Sounds good.
Okay, so I guess we will see you whenever that comes out.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much to Sarah for joining me for this episode, a very different kind of entry in our Disney Movie Marathon series, but one I'm really glad we covered. Next time we get back to this series, like we said in the episode, we'll be doing the package films from this time period, which are a lot more fun and a lot less heavy, though some parts of them can be dark in their own way. We'll get to that when we get there. Anyway, next time on iHeart Movies, I'll be doing a joint release with Every Version Ever. Over there in March, we're going to be looking at a bunch of different versions of Little Women, and we're kicking off that series with one of the most famous adaptations, the 1994 film starring Winona Ryder, Christian Bale, and a host of other big-name talent from the time. Since that version is one of the biggest, most well-known adaptations of the story, I thought it would be a good one to do a joint release with over here, since a lot more film fans will be interested in hearing about that one than, say, an obscure 1977 anime that was never released in America. Yes, that's something we'll be talking about next month over there, so check it out if that sounds interesting to you. Also, don't forget that I'm going to be trying to occasionally dip my toes in the water of audience participation this year, starting with the upcoming episode on Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. If you have any thoughts on that film that you'd like to share on the podcast, follow the link in the description below or tweet at me. Any written messages you'd like to share, I'll be reading on the show as well. Anyway, I think that's all for now. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on iHeart Movies.